Ruth Lawrence has been back in the stand again for the second day of her trial for the murder of two Dublin men in 2014. What did we hear today about the case?
Yeah, so we're into day two of hearing the actual evidence. We've had some of the witnesses, some of the more minor witnesses, I guess, that they're putting out the picture in terms of what's going to happen. But maybe to recap first, the initial opening of the trial, Michael O'Higgins kind of pretty much laid out what the prosecution case was going to be, and it's a fairly this is something that happened nearly 11 years ago. It's in April 2024. And
2014.
2014, of course, yeah. And it was unknown dates between the 22nd of April that year and the 22nd of May that she murdered Eoin O'Connor, and in identical terms, the charges were that she also murdered Anthony Keegan. Now, these are described as basically two men. One of them, Eoin O'Connor, was described to Michael O'Higgins as a drug dealer, and he'd gone down to Cavan to collect debts.
And this debt, the prosecution's case, was primarily built up by Ruth Lawrence's boyfriend, a South African national.
That's right, yeah. And this man, Neville van der Westhuizen, he's kind of mentioned in the opening statement as owing €70,000 to Eoin O'Connor. And that they kind of, they very much like, he was kind of explaining like to the jury the usual thing about, you mightn't be involved directly in killing somebody, if you're driving the car, you're still just as guilty of murder. So they were kind of explaining the whole idea of joint enterprise. But they said in Ruth Lawrence's case, it was, there was a bit of both. And that they actually said that they will be contending, or they will be putting to the jury that she actually shot one of the men. It wasn't fatal. He was finished off by Neville van der Westhuizen, who had already shot Mr. Keegan at that point. So
the case of joint enterprise, which people probably have heard and will have heard on TV programs, or it's in the common lexicon, but basically if you are involved in the planning and execution of a murder, you can be convicted of murder. You don't have to have pulled the trigger or dealt the fatal blow, as long as you are involved in all the other steps. That's sufficient.
Yeah, and he used the old analogy, which he said he's borrowed from his colleagues as well, that the man holding the ladder is as much a thief as the person who climbs in the window to steal from a house, and that's the whole point of the joint enterprise.
Yeah.
But they were suggesting in this case that he was telling the jury that we're going to have to, put certain things here, that the opening statement itself is not evidence. It's, as he put it, it's the roadmap, but it's not the journey. And the journey is the trial and listening to all the evidence. And again, it was that they had to make up their minds and they had to decide. He said, look, I don't think you'll have any trouble from their point of view, the prosecution, like saying they were murdered, but you're going to have to look at the intent and all the rest of it. The fact that, these men, one of them was shot in the head and stomach and the other was shot in the head and neck. So he feels he's certainly contending from the prosecution's point of view that they're not going to have any trouble deciding whether or not they were murdered, but they're going to have to look into that in relation to Ruth Lawrence and her actions. And he's also making the point as well that effectively it's two trials, because it's two murders that she's charged with, and one of them they're going to allege that, or they are alleging that she pulled the trigger and shot one of them, but he didn't necessarily die from that, but she had no part in shooting the other one. And then we heard some of the evidence today, which was already mentioned in the opening statement yesterday, about she'd phoned her landlord. Now we should have said, of course, this all took place in Cavan, and they were living in a place called Patrick's Cottage on the shores of Lough Sheelin. So it's kind of like a hideaway area, and they were looking for a boat. The weather was particularly nice that time, and she had said on the Monday. So everything happened kind of the Monday to Friday of this week, of this particular week, starting on the 21st of April, and she had contacted her landlord saying, could they borrow a boat from someone that's so nice, and that they couldn't necessarily row. Neville had a bad back, and this was their landlord, Declan McCabe, was on the stand today giving evidence about this. He said he could get them an electric motor. They could borrow one if that was the case. And she talked about maybe could we get a boat with a cabin, but there was no discussion as to why she would necessarily wanted a boat that was covered. There was nothing like that. We were also hearing kind of the backing up, or the evidence from people, say, who lived in a particular particular estate in Ballyjamestuff, and these would have been neighbours of Jay Sims and his daughter Stacey.
Because these are going to be probably, their evidence is going to be key in this case. Because
it was mentioned in the opening case that they will be giving evidence, that they'll be talking about how on I think it was the 22nd of April, the Tuesday, they spoke about people being hyped up, and they basically, this couple, Ruth and Neville, basically told them about what had happened. So, again in the opening statement, they were saying that Jason Sims was, he was known for dealing drugs in the area, selling weed, and he wasn't particularly good at that. His daughter Stacey, it was heard in court, she was doing a PLC at the time, and she was known to sell drugs on campus. So this is all, the jury heard of all of this. And they were told that Jason Sims owed €15,000 and Neville van der Westhuizen, he owed 70,000, and this was to Eoin O'Connor. Now we heard today, say from different people who lived on this estate in Woodlands, and they talked about the stream of people coming to the house, during the night, usually later in the evening or whatever, up to 30 people a day. And that, as far as they were concerned, there was open drug dealing going on. There was mention of a Garda raid on the house. Now, his son, Sean Sims, also, his statement was read out in court today. And he was talking about on the Monday, this unidentified man, had called to the house when he was at his father's house. He'd gone down there briefly, and they kind of looked like they pretty much wanted to have a discussion about something when he wasn't there. And then later that night, both him and his fiancée, in their statements, talked about how Jason had mentioned something about, you don't want to know that he owed money, and they overheard him speaking to his daughter Stacey, who had said, how did they find us? So the jury are hearing this kind of picture of this small-time drug dealer, Jason and Stacey, who are under pressure. Now, what happened then was Eoin O'Connor and Anthony Keegan.
And I think they said Anthony Keegan was kind of brought along.
He was brought along. He was no more than that. He was just there to kind of help Eoin O'Connor. He wasn't necessarily described as being, a drug trader or anything.
Like that, yeah.
But he was going with Eoin O'Connor to collect money, basically to collect drug debts. As we heard in the opening statement, that Jay Sims was very much under pressure, and there was this 15,000 needed immediately, and he paid over a couple of hundred on the Monday. Again, as I was saying, this is all kind of spelled out in court. Then they also mentioned so they were told, on the 22nd of April. Then there was another friend. There's a Latvian man whose spelling his name I haven't got right, so I won't mention it just in case. And he was involved in the cleanup of the premises. This is the Patrick's Cottage on Lough Sheelin, and so they were saying that they're going to allege that this was done. So that if there was a forensic examination, it'd be hard to find any evidence that they had been there. And he also brought over these H blocks, cement blocks in the figure of a H as well.
And did they say what those H blocks were to be used for? Because obviously the description of how the bodies are found was also part of the opening statement in terms of the condition they were in. Yeah,
it was, and so they were going through it. So they were explaining how I think it was on the Tuesday evening that they last saw. They can know that one of the men was seen at 6:30, and then there was a text message at 8:45 that night, and that was the last kind of indication of them being alive at any stage. So they can't. As they said to the jury, they weren't in a position to exactly pinpoint the moment these men were killed, and it wasn't until the 26th of May that their bodies were found on Inchicup Island, a small island which is very close to Patrick's Cottage. And it was two guys who'd been out fishing, and they stopped to make a cup of tea and got a very bad smell. Obviously, they got a very bad smell, and the Gardaí searched it, and they found the bodies of the two men. They were wrapped in tape, and they were bound in tape and rope and wrapped in a tarpaulin. And so then what had been a missing persons case up to that point then became a murder investigation. And now at the same time, so if you backtrack then to the week of the 21st to the 26th, so they had dropped back this electric outboard motor that they had used. They dropped that back on the Thursday.
This is Ruth and Neville.
This is Ruth and Neville. And then all four, both Ruth and Neville and the father and daughter, the Sims, they basically took off to Rosslare Neville broke into a house and they slept in a kind of recently sold house that was empty in Ashbourne and slept there for a couple of hours, and then they made their way to Fishguard through Rosslare the next day. They went into London, and then Neville, being a South African national, himself and Ruth basically went to South Africa, where they have been living up until quite recently, had been living there.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, then Jason and his daughter Stacey, they returned back then to Ireland, and they gave lengthy interviews, as they said, to the guards, and that this was that we would be hearing from them later in the case. Now they weren't there today. So
Neville van der Westhuizen, he remains in South Africa. Obviously, they're giving evidence about his involvement from the prosecution but he hasn't returned. Ruth Lawrence obviously has returned and is now on trial.
Yeah, she's in the dock this week. I mean, they say she's 45. She looks younger. She's kind of paying close attention to the case. And she was. Now we haven't heard from her yet. And they were going through the witnesses, at a fairly quick pace. Like they're saying, it's going to last till the 14th of November, so that there is quite a lot to go on. So, like for instance, today, they're going through like the real fine detail. Like for instance, today we had an auctioneer who had rented out the cottage and had rented it to Ruth Lawrence and talked about checking out her ID and her a reference from a previous landlord and all the rest, and they were paying $500 a month, and they paid a deposit in 2 months in advance, and this lease was put into court as evidence. And then we heard from a man called Anthony Roach was also called as witness. Now his sister's partner was Eoin O'Connor, one of the victims, and he was living in Baileyborough in Cavan at the time, and he spoke about how Eoin had knocked on his previous flat, but he was living upstairs, and so he heard him and he went down and he told him that he was going to Cavan. He was trying to collect a few quid, and he was asking, did he know if there was a black fella in the town? And he told him that maybe there was in Ballyjames stuff, but he didn't know. They had a discussion about who owned a particular Nissan Micra that's connected to the case as well. And he was asked, why was he looking for money? He said, look, if somebody owed money for cannabis. He said he got the last he heard of him. This is on Monday the 21st. 45 minutes later, he got another text to say that he was in Ballyjames stuff, and that was the last he heard of him. So we do know that, it was said in the opening statement as well, that Eoin O'Connor went back to Dublin that night on Monday and returned back down to Cavan again on the Tuesday. So we also had the landlord of the cottage was given evidence today, and he was recalled, and he was asked to explain about the motor on the boat and when they had dropped it, and the fact that Neville and Ruth had collected the motor in a van and then returned it the next day. On the Wednesday, they were driving their BMW, which it was a bit different, because they didn't drive it as much. We had a guy called John Watson, and he was another resident in Woodlands. So he was asked about what he had seen. So we got into some of what happened on the Wednesday was that some family members related to Eoin O'Connor had turned up in Ballyjames stuff and were searching for Eoin O'Connor. So this is late on the Wednesday evening, and he was talking about that. He was talking about some of the people had turned up, not just him as well. So you had John Watson. He was talking about more on the Tuesday, and about people looking for Jay Sims' house, and that a fella he knew, Philip Caldwell, who was from the town as well. He saw him in the estate as well, and he spoke. Philip Caldwell was called as a witness, and he talked about how these guys from Dublin pulled up and they asked him, did he know where Jay Sims did. He's trying to explain where he lived, and he said, hop in the car and show me. So off he went and showed them, and that was the end of his involvement in that.
And we also heard about two drug dealers, didn't we, that were described only as Mr. AB, was it?
Mr. AB and Mr. DC, yeah. CD, yeah. And we're not allowed to, they can't be named at this stage. But they were they were part of the wider, I suppose, drug network that Neville van der Westhuizen is alleged to have bought his drugs from, and that Jay Sims would sometimes get his supply that he would sell either from Van der Westhuizen or from Eoin O'Connor, which was that was put to, the jury heard all this as well.
And does it describe what level of, obviously it said that Neville van der Westhuizen had built up this debt of 70,000. So does it describe what types of drugs or
No, the only drugs that we've heard being mentioned so far is cannabis. Now, there was mentioned that there were other drugs taken as well on the night after the alleged killing. This is when there was an atmosphere in the house and people were hyped up, and they were talking about how the men were killed and their bodies disposed of. I suppose today there was more kind of concentration on the aftermath of Eoin O'Connor going missing and his family turning up. So, so Sean Sims, was talking about how, certainly one person he identified in his statement as Rory O'Connor, as a brother of Eoin O'Connor, and, turning up at his house and, basically saying, first of all, looking for his father, looking for Mr. Sims' number and where we would find him. And then, getting increasingly more irate. He's called his house on 3 occasions before the bodies are found. And on 2 of those occasions, there was 2 carloads of people, 10 or 15 guys, and there was threats being screamed at him that his fingers were going to be cut off, that his throat would be slit in front of his children, and that they were saying, look, it's not about the money now, it's about Eoin. I want to find my brother. And so he actually fled at one point after calling the guards. He fled at one point to the north of Ireland with his partner and kids, that they were so frightened and didn't basically want to go back to Ballyjames stuff at that stage. And it seemed like quite a stressful situation for everyone to be in. Like his partner Celine Coburn talked about it as well, and she said they were absolutely terrified. They were saying at one point, these guys have turned up outside, and he said, look, if we don't find your father, we'll be back. And she says, they stand there, the car doors are open. She says, we were very frightened. I thought all these people, she said she thought these were the people that Jay had owed money to. He says, they rang the guards, they sent their car out. And that's when they fled to the north. And then the other kind of witnesses were very much about kind of placing this silver Ford Focus that Eoin O'Connor had borrowed from his mother to go down to Ballyborough Inn, and that was parked up in Lough, which is kind of a viewing point over the lake just outside of Mullingar on the way down. So there was people kind of saying, yeah, I was there and I saw this car and I thought it was unusual because it was parked in an unusual way. There's a routine Garda patrol had seen the car as well, and they knew it wasn't there at 3:20 on I think it was the Wednesday night, but the witnesses were able to say then it was there at 8:20 the next day. So it was a kind of a time frame. So they're putting this all through. This is all kind of in the book of evidence, and I suppose they're laying down the case about all the kind of the circumstantial evidence is what they're getting at this stage. And
did we hear much about mobile phones and all that, which have been such a feature of?
There isn't. We haven't heard any. Not the kind of evidence that you're talking about. There was nothing like that in terms of, say, tracking mobile phones. It has been mentioned that the mobile phone traffic, would show that Eoin O'Connor was in touch with Neville van der Westhuizen. So that was mentioned in the opening statement. So we do expect we will probably see that. I think next week. The court will be back, and I guess we're going to hear more of this technical stuff. But when we're going to hear from other witnesses about what the accused woman, Ruth Lawrence, actually did, on the 23rd or the 22nd, they're not 100% when certain things happened.
Yeah.
So we're not going to hear that until those witnesses are called, which we expect. It was mentioned that Jason Sims would be giving evidence that we would be hearing from them from their interviews with the guards. So. We'll probably hear more of the details then of what exactly is alleged to have happened then at that point.
Yeah, well, we'll keep coming back, Eamon, to it because it's a very interesting case, and it's quite a long case then they've set aside for it. But
yeah, it's stand like the jury have been told that it's up to the 14th of November. I mean, there was quite the process, a lengthy enough process. One of the mornings, explaining to the jury how far they should go, or how long it would go, and that if anyone had any issues, and there was questions from the jury about what about lunch and can we leave the building? The usual stuff, and these are all kind of the judge is always happy to kind of address these situations.
Yeah. Okay, and we'll come back to it this week as the case goes on.
No worries. Thanks, Niall.
Thanks.